So far, we've mostly focused on invention, that canon of rhetoric, which asks us how we come up with the material we're going to speak about. Specifically, how do we discover arguments in a particular controversy? Or delivery, the enactment of speech, the use of tone, gesture, facial expression in order to communicate our meaning to our audience. In this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about another canon of rhetoric, which is arrangement. Now we have all of this stuff that we want to say. We have arguments, we have counter arguments. What is the order in which we should put it? Sometimes people will call this structure, and sometimes people will imagine arrangement as being handled by an outline. While I do encourage you to work with a written outline, use the outlining strategies that maybe you know from other classes, I want to give you some rhetorically specific ways to think about arrangement. The first part of a speech in classical rhetoric was called the exordium, or sometimes the proemion. These are very uncommon words, but one of the meanings of that second word gives us a sense of what might be imagined for that first part of the speech. The proemion means something like the prelude, the music before the main piece. This is an important aspect of your speech that's supposed to draw your audience into the topic, but it might do this with something that is maybe related to it in an accidental or in an exemplary way. So maybe you begin with a narrative, an example that's going to speak to the importance of your problem, a story about someone who's been affected by a problem that you wish to seek a remedy for in your speech. Or maybe you start with a joke. That is something that sometimes is pretty common in how people will deliver speeches when they're in a live setting in order to put the audience at ease. But we really want something that's kind of maybe humorous that suggests something about the nature of the topic that we're talking about. The exordium is one of the aspects of the speech where you have a great deal of creative freedom. Thinking about how you introduce this, you might think about a few principles of what makes for a good exordium. First, it should be vivid. There should be something about what you say at the beginning of your speech that has some aspect of sensory detail and whose meaning is really clear to your audience. Vividness is very important. Second, it should have some kind of emotional effect on the audience. And again, the emotional effect doesn't have to be some kind of powerful passion at this point in the speech. It doesn't have to be pity or terror or fear. It could be interest or amusement or something like that. Finally, the exordium should give the audience a sense of what's going to come without making it fully explicit. The second part of your speech is called the narratio, which just means the narration. This is the statement of what is going on. What's the situation that you're speaking about? What's the problem going on in the world? So if you're talking about, let's say, sports gambling, you might describe the recent background of the legislation and the effect that it's had on sports games. If you're talking about something like comprehensive sex education, you might talk about the context for recent controversies on this topic and the effect that they've had on people. Next comes division. This is where you announce what is going to come in the rest of your speech. This is really an opportunity to let your audience hear what the argumentative claims are that you're going to make. So rather than just saying, first I'm going to talk about advantages and then disadvantages, what you really want to do here in the division section is craft a small image of your entire argument and framing it in the language that you think is most persuasive. You might look at a supplementary lecture here on terministic screens that I'll also post. The concept of terministic screens is that even in our choice of language and terms, we're selecting, deflecting, and reflecting some part of reality. We're making rhetorical choices and argumentative choices when we choose language. The next two parts of the speech are the heart of your case. The first one is the confirmatio, or the proof of the case, where you lay out all of the positive arguments for your case. That is, the things that support the claims that you yourself are making. So you have already done that in a recent exercise, but now you want to elaborate it with the best evidence that you can and frame it in a way that's as informative as possible. The section after that is the confutatio, or the refutation section, where you take what you think are the most relevant counterclaims and you argue against them. These two sections are the heart of your speech. This is where your case really makes itself heard. So I would say that probably when you're thinking about this form of arrangement, you're trying to make this part of your speech the best possible. Now we come to the conclusion of the speech, sometimes called the peroratio. That's a very fancy term, but I think it does give us a different sense of what's called for in the conclusion of a speech than the word conclusion does. We're probably likely to have heard people end speeches with this phrase, in conclusion, and then they say a summary of their case. The peroratio has a sense of thoroughness, of throughness, of impact. This is the place where the most impassioned parts of your speech should go. Sometimes, yes, people will make a call to action. Here's what you can do. But really, it's a place where we're calling people to the significance of what we've talked about. What has changed in our audience's attitude from the beginning of the speech to the end? Another thing that can be very useful, if you spend some time in that exordium developing an image, a story, some kind of important idea, returning to that same idea now with all of its vividness and showing some other element of it or how we might relate to it differently. One of those principles we might think about is amplification, or a crescendo kind of effect, if you know from music, where something gets kind of gradually louder. So let's say we're in the confirmation section of the speech, where we're laying out our proofs. We might want to put them in some kind of order or sequence that shows an increase of, let's say, intensity. If I'm talking about a problem with fast fashion, maybe I'll first talk about the problem of the fact that it doesn't look very good. It doesn't have a great aesthetic quality. Then maybe I'll turn to the labor conditions of fast fashion. Beyond just how they look on us, think about how they are produced. They're produced in such a way that they really take away people's livelihoods, their ability to live a good life. And not only that, then we talk about the environmental effect, how that's something that affects everybody, but it's invisible. So I'm moving forward in a number of different ways. On the one hand, it's about visibility, from what we can see to what we often cannot see as an effect, but also at the level of the impact of the effect. Me not looking very good, well, me in particular, I probably often don't look very good, but maybe you're more concerned with fashion than I am. That might nevertheless not be as big an effect as someone else in the world not being able to have a good life because of their labor conditions. But then we might think of the environmental effect as having even greater impact because of how many people it affects. Another thing you might consider, especially when it comes to examples or evidence, is the rule of 1, 2, 3. If I give one example of something, that usually leads to the idea that this is representative. It would be really weird if I were telling you a story, let's say about euthanasia, and I said that I was opposing euthanasia, but I gave you an example of a story that someone had an experience that was really important for them, and I said, but that's an exception to the rule. Well, then why tell that as the story? Usually we would want a story or an example or a piece of evidence when I know that it's being selected from a larger body of possibilities to be representative in some sense of the whole. Even though it might be unique and vivid in some way, we don't want it to be strange or exceptional. When I give two of something, that often leads an audience to think in comparative terms, to put these two examples, two stories, two pieces of evidence next to each other. So if I use two things, I might be suggesting that, and maybe I should use that force to my advantage. Well, let's look at the effect of what proponents of this issue say on one side versus what opponents say. Which is bigger? How do we weigh things up? So if I give two of something, we're doing weighing, we're doing comparison. And finally, three of anything, like the rule of three in stories and fairy tales and often in comedy, suggests a certain kind of continuation or, like I was saying before, maybe a sense of increase of intensity. It suggests that there's more to the story than what I'm giving. I'm giving three because three is enough for you to recognize a pattern or a sequence without me having to go on indefinitely. A sort of word of warning, but also a practice that you might use in order to test how well arranged your speech is. If you were to represent your entire speech as one sentence, it it would probably be a pretty long sentence, but it should be a complex sentence as opposed to a compound sentence. Now, I'm not trying to harass you by having you remember sixth grade grammar or whatever. But the difference between a complex and a compound sentence is based on the kinds of conjunction or transitions that it uses. A compound sentence uses ands. And, also, again, also. If your speech has a lot of those kinds of words in it as transitions, it suggests a kind of loose or gluey arrangement. Almost anything can be put together with an and. That doesn't mean that you can't use those kinds of conjunctions. Obviously, often they are appropriate. But if the entire speech is glued together, it doesn't suggest that there's a lot of articulation in the relationships between the parts of the speech. So what we want in a complex sentence are either conjunctions of causality or qualification, things like because or despite, or even opposition, but, however, yet. One last thing. Have you ever gone to a party that was maybe over-arranged, where there was something that was always planned out for you to do? That can feel a little bit stifling. It doesn't really feel like that much fun. At the same time, maybe you've also been to a party where you were invited over, maybe you even paid a cost at the door for, let's say, like a frat party or something like that, and there was almost nothing provided to you. It was just a bunch of folding chairs and not even really any food, maybe a couple Chex Mix bowls or something like that. In both of these cases, these are examples of what arrangement can do badly for an audience. The audience doesn't want to feel like they're on railroad tracks, that they're being forced to consider something in one way. Your arrangement should correspond to your understanding of what your audience might be thinking, might be imagining. You want to anticipate possible objections that may be in the mind of your audience. Or you might want to encourage and enhance or intensify the values and the feelings that your audience already has, as well as suggesting to them new things that you think are important or relevant. At the same time, you don't want to give your audience so much freedom that you just throw a bunch of things out and say, do with it what you will. They might feel kind of neglected. They might feel like they're not really being attended to. Your arrangement of your speech should show like the arrangement of a party, a concern both for what your audience might already expect, what they might want, but also their ability to freely think, freely move around in your speech, do different kinds of things in your speech. So you might think of the kinds of arrangements or preparations you're making in your speech for your audience, like arranging a good party.